Happy Sunday, everybody. This is Daniel Wallach, the co-host of Conduct Detrimental, along with Michael Lawson, producer of Conduct Detrimental, as well as an associate at O'Connell and Aronowitz. We've decided to start, or at least have a special Sunday episode devoted to sports betting. We don't have the name of a podcast, but we're going to kind of call this Sports Betting Industry Roundup. And the reason why we're recording on Sunday is that tomorrow, Monday, April 4th, are two very important deadlines in two of the largest states in the country to either introduce or amend sports betting bills. And the Georgia legislature is on the clock until tomorrow. And the New York legislature and the governor had an April 1st deadline to finalize the New York state budget, and they're overdue. But constitutionally, I believe that there's a Monday end of day actual real deadline, and we're going to find out whether any changes are in store for New York's online sports betting framework. And that's just a couple, or those are just a couple of the issues we're going to cover today on Sports Betting Industry Roundup. Michael, how are you? What are we going to cover today? We got a couple of key states at issue.
I'm good, Dan. I'm good. Yes, we definitely have some big topic issues that you were talking about. Obviously, Georgia and New York are at the top of our list, especially with their deadlines. New York has been all over the place with their legalization. We're going to talk about their Court of Appeals ruling on daily fantasy sports, but we also have some Buffalo Bills news and the public funding with Buffalo Bills and their new stadium. And then we're also going to cover Kansas and Missouri and how close they are to their legalization of sports gambling too. So it's a packed issue, a topic for sports gambling all over the place.
Well, we wanted to cover Kansas and Missouri because those two states are keeping a watchful eye on one another. It's seemingly a race to see which one gets to launch first, which one will have the better of the two tax rates. They're definitely paying attention to what the other state does. And as I pointed out on Twitter, if this could be a good opportunity for sports betting proponents in both states, because if one passes, so too will the other one. And I believe both states have already approved sports betting measures out of one chamber of the state legislature. And now it kicks over to the second house within their respective state legislatures. And I think we're going to have legal sports betting in Kansas, Missouri, but maybe not in Georgia. So we're going to lead off with the state of Georgia, whose legislative session ends on Monday, April 4th. And to this point, the state legislature is seemingly all over the map with 24 hours left to go on the deadline. At least to me, there seem to be many fundamental differences between what the Georgia Senate and what the Georgia House want to accomplish with sports betting.
I'm gonna pitch it right back to you when it comes to the differences here, but let's just set it up for a bit. So Georgia came very close last year, right? We saw the expiration of their deadline on last year's session deadline, which was March 31st of 2021. We saw the bill that was proposed in March of last year, and then the deadline expired on March 31st of 2021 for their legalization. We saw there was some political tension that really took precedent in Georgia. So at this point, what we have now is the developments coming from the last year. So we have Republican Ron Stevens, who is really forging ahead. He's really making sure that we have he wants that Georgia has legalization of sports gambling. And like you said, we have right now, even though the deadline is tomorrow, we have a lot of differences going back and forth between the House and the Senate. So Dan, can you talk about, I think one of the biggest issues right now is we have this number of licenses, and they're kind of far apart. They're not that close. The number of licenses between the two, the House wants to have a 9x9, 18 overall, where we have 9 that are kind of tethered to pro teams, and then you have 9 that are untethered. And then the Senate is stuck on a number that's far below that, being 6 licenses. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I want to take a step back for a second. What's interesting about Georgia, Kansas, Missouri, and New York, just to show how far we've come with the legalization of sports betting. Originally, in the first year after PASPA was overturned, focus was on casinos and racetracks and maybe state lotteries. But these 4 states, New York, Kansas, Missouri, Georgia, have provisions in place to allow the professional sports teams within those states to operate either online sports betting or to have in-stadium, sports betting or in-stadium kiosks. That's almost unprecedented, but now in 2021 or 22, that's now becoming the norm with Maryland, Arizona, Washington, D.C., Illinois, it's almost like the guiding principle going forward now, that if there's a way in Ohio and Maryland as well, that the teams are now picking up the mantle from the professional sports leagues, which were seeking royalties and other types of direct benefits at the league level. And with the exception of official league data mandates, the leagues weren't successful in convincing any state legislature to give them a direct cut of the action. So instead, what I see taking place to fill that void and to give the sports industry stakeholders direct economic participation is to be able to get the licenses themselves, even if they're not the actual license holders and their designees, the license holder. In substantial part, in large part, the teams are going to control sports betting licenses in each of these states. So let's go back. Let's start with Georgia, because I think Georgia is running into like less than 24 hours from now. We're going to find out one way or the other whether sports betting will become legal in Georgia, and if so, what it will look like. And I don't want to get anyone's hopes up too high, because my friend, colleague that I've known in the gaming industry, Jeremy Kudon, who's the lobbyist for DraftKings, FanDuel, and the professional sports leagues, one of his favorite expressions is that state legalizations of gambling bills and sports betting bills are like Hall of Fame candidates. There are very few first ballot Hall of Famers. Georgia is, I believe, on the third year of trying. So, maybe Georgia, might make the Veterans Committee by the time all this is done. But the problem with Georgia is that lawmakers have tried to expand gambling every year for the past quarter of a century. And it's a conservative state. It's still still a red state, extremely conservative politically. And there's just general anti-gambling sentiment in the Georgia Senate. No gambling expansion bill has been passed by the state legislature since 1992. So if you're handicapping the race here, you're looking at, okay, conservative state, nothing passed in a quarter of a century, all these differences between the various bills, and only one day left in the legislative session. It's not really going out on a limb here to say Georgia's probably not going to get it done by tomorrow, but let's highlight some of these differences, Michael. You highlighted that the bill from last year, which I believe was proposed by the Senate, included a minimum of 6 online sports betting licenses. It wasn't a cap. It wasn't an outer restriction. It was a minimum of 6. It could be 15. It could be 20, 25. But what the House amendment did, and I believe a House committee approved an amendment that would create 18 licenses, 9, half of which that would go to Georgia's professional sports teams, and the other 9 of which would be untethered, meaning anybody could apply for them, within reason. And we know who's going to be the typical applicants. Those licenses are going to go to DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, and all the, all the
Caesars, BetRivers, PointsBet.
Yeah, go down the line. But 9 is a very small amount when you consider all the would-be online sports betting operators that want to get into the various jurisdictions. And in New York, they have 9, and it's still not enough. You have Bet365, look on the outside looking in, you have Fanatics. So it's problematic in that the House version allows for more licenses, but it's a cap on the number of licenses, where the Senate version had a starting point of 6 licenses without any cap or limit on the number of operators that can become licensed. So that's one fundamental difference. What do you think about that kind of divide? I mean, I think it could be bridged, but it's still a significant difference between the 2 proposals.
I think it is, and I think the significant factor of it is being tethered to the sports teams, right? The 6 is the minimum that you said, and it also kind of caters to what we're going to talk about next, the differences that they have between the tax rates of each license. But at the same time, you have all the pro teams coming out of Atlanta and Georgia, and the House wanted to make sure, I think that's what you were just talking about, the fact that these sports franchises wanted to get a cut of it. And that was the House kind of catering to that, where they were going to tether them to those pro teams, giving them the licenses, versus the Senate, which is just doing probably your typical bid process where we're going to talk about, FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars.
Well, no,
they're going to come in.
It's not going to be bidding. It's going to be a specified tax rate in the Senate version at 16%, the House version at 20%. It just, the bidding or the qualification to determine who gets the licenses. Is it going to be 6? Is it going to be 8? Is it going to be 10? I think that's kind of a low barrier to entry. If you're one of the major operators, you're going to get it. And on the tethering portion, you got to remember something about Georgia. They do not have horse race track betting. There are no horse race tracks in Georgia. There are no casinos in Georgia. This is sort of like open terrain for the professional sports teams in that state to write the rules of the road, just like what we saw a year ago, where the Texas sports betting proposal would have granted sports betting licenses to all of Texas's professional sports franchises, online sports betting licenses, as well as in-stadium sports books. And the reason why those asks are occurring in Texas and Georgia is that there's no in-state competition. There are no casinos. In Georgia, there are no racetracks. In Texas, there are very few racetracks. There's no competition, and the leagues and the teams are not going to get the same kind of pushback on the licensing entitlement that they might, for example, get in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, which are dominated by the casino industry.
And I think that's another reason why this is more unlikely that it's not going to happen within the next 24 hours, because we're talking about just the differences in number of licenses, haven't even talked about the tax rate issue yet either, but we have the issue that there is no casinos, right? So do these include casino gambling? They're talking about there would be some sort of legislative amendment on top of these bills later on to include pari-mutuel betting and casino gambling. Whether or not that actually happens, I feel like Georgia's throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, because then they're talking about constitutional amendments where they need a 2/3 majority vote, and then further legislative action later on with it that would just need a minority vote for the amendments.
Mike, you hit on the biggest obstacle that I feel stands in the way of legalized sports betting. The House is trying to take on too much in an anti-gambling state,
right?
Or generally a state that has some reservations about gambling expansion. Don't try to shoehorn casino gambling, pari-mutuel betting, and sports betting into a single proposed constitutional amendment and then write the rules later. Let's focus on sports betting. I think the Senate bill was very sports betting. It was sports betting focused, whereas the House at the 11th hour, literally 24 hours now from the deadline, are now including a proposal to amend the state constitution to allow, number 1, sports betting, number 2, casino gambling, and number 3, pari-mutuel betting on horse racing. The Senate, I believe it was the Senate that just turned down pari-mutuel betting on horse racing, a week or 2 weeks ago. So why is the House trying to pair sports betting with all these other forms of gambling? And if I'm in the Senate and I have some concerns about gambling expansion, I don't want to give, I don't want to have sort of a rubber stamp or at least a blank slate on casino gambling or pari-mutuel betting without knowing what the rules of the road are. And the House bill that accompanies the proposed constitutional amendment only has specifics on the issue of online sports betting, but there are no specifics with regard to casino gambling and pari-mutuel betting, even though they've proposed a constitutional amendment that would include the allowance of casino gambling and sports betting. So there's a lack of symmetry between the constitutional amendment bill and the implementation bill, which both have to be approved by the legislature at the same time this year. I mean, they're trying to basically say, let's pass the constitutional amendment now and worry about, implementing casino gambling and horse race betting a year from now. I don't think that's going to work in a state that hasn't had any significant gambling expansion in almost 30 years. That's a bridge too far.
Absolutely. And that's exactly that's the biggest point of contention right now is why would you try to sneak in a lot of those things where they've been talking about sports gambling? And like you said, the Senate has already turned down the pari-mutuel aspect of it. So it doesn't seem to me, at least when I was looking through all this, it does not seem to me that a deal is going to be done, that they're going to have anything agreed upon before this deadline.
Yeah, I'm not a big proponent of using the constitutional amendment process when it's unnecessary. Under the Georgia Constitution, there's a ban on casino gambling, there's a ban on pari-mutuel betting, and there's a ban on lotteries. There's no ban on sports betting. Sports betting does not fit within the categorization of any of those things, but I understand that the legislature wants to have sort of passing the buck to the electorate and not face the political accountability or consequences. from voting in favor of some type of gambling expansion, but they don't even need to do it. This can be done legislatively because sports wagering it's a game of skill. It's tied to events that are outside of casinos. It has nothing to do with casino gambling. And on top of that, there's a carve out in the state constitution to allow the state-run lottery to operate games like this. So even if it qualified as a game of chance that would be otherwise banned by the state constitution, the fact that the lottery has the constitutional authority to run these types of games, I think would have made for a cleaner bill, have it passed just by a bare majority vote. Instead, they're going this uphill, longer, two-tiered route of needing to get 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House to approve this and then pass it along to the electorate. I think this is a big deal to get sports betting legal in Georgia. Georgia is the 8th largest state. And I've been to that airport. Have you ever been in the Atlanta airport with all this downtime? God, it would be amazing to be able to have the ability to make internet-based sports wagers. And this is the world's largest, I think this hemisphere's largest commuter airport. Georgia is one of those giant sleeper states for online sports betting due to its population size and air travel and all the millions of people who go through that airport with this downtime on your hands with nothing to do except to go to the food court.
I've certainly had layovers there, so I know what you're talking about. There's you could be in there for quite a while, a couple hours at least. So I definitely can see that. So
it's a no. It's not going to pass. Do you feel any differently? I mean, I think we need to predict what we see here.
My prediction's a no. I agree with you. I just don't. There's too much in the way. There's too much being thrown at the wall at the same time. Where I think you're right. You hit it right on the head. If they had just come together and formed something that exclusively was about sports gambling and didn't include parimutuel, didn't include constitutional amendments, didn't include casino gambling, it would have been a lot easier for them to come to some sort of middle ground. At that point, it doesn't matter what the sports gambling aspects, their differences between licenses and tax rates and stuff like that. They can't come to an agreement on the other constitutional amendments of casino gambling, parimutuel with horse racing. So it's just going to bog down the fact that they could have come to an agreement with sports gambling.
All right, so I'm going to be looking for nonstop flights and bypass the Atlanta airport.
Yeah. No more Atlanta travel.
When I go to Mississippi to attend the gaming conference in Gulfport. Where is it? No, it's Biloxi, Mississippi. I go to the Southern Gaming Summit many years, and I have to travel through Atlanta. So if I'm going to Mississippi, I guess that will be the one and only time I have to go through the Georgia airport. So anyway, what do we have up next? We're only 1/4 of the way through, and I think there are a couple of other states that are equally worthy of discussion.
Yeah, we definitely want to hit. I think next we talked about the rivalry between Kansas and Missouri right now, how close both of them are to their legalization of sports gambling. We'd be remiss to mention the fact that Kansas has the national championship game coming up. Kansas basketball is facing UNC, so that is a big opportunity, or I guess a missed opportunity. The fact that they don't have the legalization. So, Dan, give a rundown of the competitiveness between Kansas and Missouri, and the fact that both of them are kind of playing off of each other, and they both have, like I think you mentioned right from the start, they both have had at least one house, one party agree to the sports gambling bill, and at this point they're just waiting to see it go forward. But they have less of a deadline. But I know that Missouri has an April 6th hearing where they're going to talk about this. So what do you have for us, Dan?
Yeah, Missouri has a hearing coming up this week. They have until May 13th before the legislative session ends. And, this notion that one house of the legislature has already passed a sports betting bill. What I'm finding is that there's a disconnect in almost every state legislature between the House and the Senate, or between the Senate and the General Assembly. It's almost commonplace to have states authorize or at least pass a sports betting bill out of one chamber of the legislature, and then the other chamber is the big problem. I mean, New York has had the New York State Senate approving sports betting going back 3 years, and it could never get to a vote in the Assembly. Massachusetts House of Representatives has already approved a sports betting bill, and it's not even getting to a floor debate yet in the Senate. So, call me not exactly convinced that just because Kansas and Missouri have achieved approval from one house of their respective state legislatures that now the momentum is in favor of legalization, because I think in those two states, especially within Missouri, there's a strong political dynamic between the House and the Senate. And for the past couple of years, while there was a lot of interest in passing a sports betting bill in Missouri, it got hung up on the issue of regulation of video lottery terminals. In New York State, the state lottery is allowed to have these video lottery terminals at various facilities. In Missouri, the casino industry, I think there were 13 or so casinos. They are dead set against any notion of regulating these VLTs for the benefit of the lottery. And the reason why that has entered the discussion for sports betting is that the chief proponent of sports betting in previous years is a state senator by the name of Denny Hoskins. And over the prior two legislative sessions, Senator Hoskins has paired the issue of sports wagering with video lottery terminal regulations. So just as Georgia lawmakers are trying to sort of shoehorn in these disparate types of gambling into one omnibus bill, the efforts have fallen short in Missouri because the casino industry has been opposed to any sports wagering bill that allows these types of slot machine style games to also be legalized and operated at truck stops and gas stations all over the state, because that's going to cannibalize the traffic that goes to these land-based casinos. So in 2022, we now have the first time in Missouri's attempt at legalizing sports betting of having separate bills for VLTs and sports betting legalization. And for that reason, sports betting, I believe, sailed through the House of Representatives at a shockingly low tax rate of 8%. Now, contrast that with New York, which has a 51% tax rate. Georgia, which has proposed tax rates of either 16% or 20%. Missouri is on the low end of the spectrum of 8%. And the reason they've chosen 8% is that they're looking next door at what Kansas is doing. There's this battle, this interstate rivalry between Kansas and Missouri, and they're watching what the other does. So if one has a low tax rate, the other is going to try to undercut it. And if the other launches sports betting or passes a bill, well, certainly Missouri is going to be doing that. And I think this dynamic of trying to outgun or outdo the adjacent state is, for the first time in the history of this 3-year post-PASPA process, we're truly having the action by one state have a channeling effect on what another state does. And for 3 years, I've been decrying New York's absence from online sports betting by pointing to the results in New Jersey. And that hasn't swayed, or that had not swayed Governor Andrew Cuomo for close to 3 years. But now Missouri and Kansas are the perfect test case, or the perfect illustration of the so-called fear of missing out by one state having it and then the next door neighbor not. These two states compete on sports betting. They're competing for the Kansas City Chiefs. There's a proposal to try to, or at least some rumor, that the Kansas City Chiefs would entertain a relocation to the state of Kansas, which may be one reason why professional sports franchises are included within the Kansas sports betting bill. So, using that as the setup, even though the sessions are weeks away from concluding, the fact that they're competing against one another, I think, creates this scenario where if one passes, both are going to pass. And now that each has cleared one chamber of their state legislature, I think this truly is momentum. However, the Senate side of the sports betting debate in Missouri is not marching in lockstep with the Missouri House. The Missouri House has passed an 8% tax rate. The Senate version that has been proposed by Senator Denny Hoskins is asking for 21% tax rate on sports betting revenues. And that's the real big divide between the two states. I think otherwise, you're looking at the casinos getting retail and online sports betting. And, I think the House version approved 3 skins apiece for each of the 13 casino facilities. And then any of those facilities which are under common ownership, like if an operator owns 2 or 3 casinos, they're capped at 6 licenses. So the way it's set up is that the sports teams are going to be allocated 6 licenses and the casinos are going to be allocated 33 online sports betting licenses to be divided amongst the 13 facilities.
I think if we're going to compare just to the topic we just talked about, Georgia, right? The difference between why we don't think Georgia is going to pass is exactly why we were talking about the fact that they don't have casino gambling and they don't have horse racing and parimutuel betting. But here we already have that, and that's incorporated. We have the casino gambling, and they're being incorporated. So they're not trying to throw that in there. So that's an added difficulty that these two have. And you hit it perfectly. I was going to say the difference between New York and New Jersey. The reason is, right, you have Kansas and Missouri. They are neighboring states. And if one passes and the other falls behind, then you have to believe exactly what was happening in New York, where you had people crossing state lines, citizens of New York crossing state lines into New Jersey to place their bets, to be geolocated within the boundaries of New Jersey where it was legal, and then coming back to New York. So exactly what you were saying, if Kansas passes it and Missouri doesn't, you have to believe that Missouri residents are going to cross state lines and go into Kansas to make their bets on the Kansas City Chiefs, who are within Missouri, right? And then you have, or vice versa. And I think you made it pretty obvious, or clear that the incentive of Kansas to incorporate possibly moving Kansas City Chiefs into Kansas because of including the pro teams. There's definitely a rivalry between the rumors that the Kansas City Chiefs have made about possibly moving. You have the casino licenses, but the tax revenue is interesting because it appears that Missouri, with the low tax, is going to have such a low threshold for a lot of these teams to come in. Are they catering? Do you think they're catering to the fact that most of their bets are going to be placed on the Kansas City Chiefs and not taking into account the fact that they have to accommodate the higher percent that Kansas has?
No, I think what's driving this is that in both Kansas and Missouri, the casino industry and the sports teams are supportive of the measures. And in Georgia, the sports teams are supportive of the Georgia bill. Missouri faced had a unique, agreement between the professional sports teams and the casino industry to sort of agree on a proposed framework, because the casinos didn't want to see the VLTs, the video lottery terminals, being proposed and approved, and the casino industry enlisted the support of the professional sports teams. So with the sports teams and the casinos backing a sports betting measure in Missouri, that you pretty much eliminated any opposition or organized opposition to sports betting, with the exception of maybe the Missouri Lottery would certainly love to generate the tax revenue that would be created by having VLT machines all over the state of Missouri. But I don't think they're that much of a factor here in the lobbying and in the legislative debate. I think what this is going to come down to is finding a sweet spot on the tax rate. I mean, 21% is kind of high. It has precedent in Tennessee at 20%, Pennsylvania 34%, New York, New Hampshire, 51. Rhode Island at 51%. So you can point to comparators that have equally high tax rates that are 21% or over, but the median tax rate for online sports betting and the more typical tax rate that you find is somewhere in the neighborhood of the low to mid-teens. So I think there's a way to bridge the gap between 8% on the House side. By the way, the House measure had been 10% until a last-minute amendment dropped it inexplicably to 8%. So I think there's room between the 8/10% and 21%, and I think they land in the middle at somewhere around at 15%, which is a very healthy tax rate, and it's not budging too far off of either side's tax proposal. And one thing going in favor of Missouri is that, unlike Georgia, which has to do a ballot question and a state, constitutional amendment, Missouri is just going to be a pure legislative and statutory enactment without the necessity of a voter question. And there are some who might argue that, well, if casinos had to be authorized by a constitutional amendment in Missouri, so too does sports wagering, because there's language in the Missouri Constitution that provides that casino gambling has to take place within 1,000 feet of, some, water line, with very specific, bodies of water mentioned. But casino gambling and sports betting are two different species of gambling. I wrote a law review article. It's about to be published in Chapman Law Review, kind of going through all the distinctions between sports betting and casino gambling. And sports betting is tethered to activities that take place external to a casino environment. It's a skill-based endeavor. Casino gambling is entirely housed within a casino, and they're games predominantly of chance or luck. And historically, in all these governmental surveys and studies and public opinion polling, sports betting and casino gambling have always been viewed as separate and distinct categories of gambling. So I don't think there's a constitutional issue at all in Missouri. It just comes down to the Senate being comfortable with the tax rate and finding, some, compromise on other areas of disagreement. And I have to think that with Kansas likely to approve sports betting, Missouri is going to try to hit the ground running first, and they've got more complications in launching sports betting in Missouri, because there are going to be 39 online sports betting licenses. There are going to be 13 properties, and in total there are going to be in excess of 50 distribution points in Missouri, whereas in Kansas it's going to be legalized for the 4 state licensed casinos. There's going to be 4 lottery gaming facility managers, aka casinos, 4 casinos that will control retail sports betting, and each of those entities will get 3 online skins. So you're talking about 12 licenses in Kansas versus 50 plus licenses in Missouri. And just if you do the math, the Missouri Gaming Commission, that's what they're called, Missouri Gaming Commission, is going to be a lot busier than the Kansas Horse Racing Commission. So if Missouri wants to get out in front of Kansas in terms of a launch date, I think they've got to pass a bill before Kansas does, and have these rules and regulations promulgated, toot sweet, so that licenses can get issued and sports betting can actually launch in time for the NFL season. So I think Missouri really is on the clock, because it's certainly more complicated to launch sports betting in Missouri than it would be in Kansas.
Yeah, they definitely. There's a lot more for Kansas to flesh out, or I'm sorry, for Missouri to flesh out versus Kansas here. So, all right, we did it for Georgia. We're going to do it for Kansas and Missouri. Obviously, Kansas and Missouri is not under the gun as Georgia is, with the 24-hour kind of deadline that they have. What is your prediction, Dan, on Kansas and Missouri having some sort of legalization, I guess, within the next couple of months? I mean, Kansas would be a very quick turnaround if they try to get everything up and running by the 2022 NFL season. That'd be a really, really quick turnaround for them.
Well, it's still a missed opportunity for Kansas, because the NCAA men's basketball championship game is 24 hours from now. And they had a chance to pass a bill last year, and they would have been able to reap all the revenues from statewide gambling on the Kansas, final game on Monday night. It's going to not even God, or a miracle could create legal sports betting in Kansas by tomorrow night. So it's a missed opportunity. But I say yes to both states for several reasons. A lot of momentum on their side. It's already been approved in one house of the state legislature of both states. The industry, the stakeholders are supportive of the measure. And there's plenty of time left in the legislative session. I think it's May 20th for Kansas, May 13th for Missouri. So I think there are some other deadlines where it has to be, delivered by a certain date. But with more than 1 month left in the legislative session, industry support, one house approval, and most importantly, fear and jealousy over the other state getting it and getting it first, I think I would put Kansas and Missouri in the high likelihood / virtual certainty category of passing a sports betting bill this year and launching in time for the beginning of the NFL regular season of 2022.
I certainly have to agree with you there, but maybe I should have pitched a better question. What state is going to pass first? That's the question.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think it's going to be Kansas. I think it's going to be Kansas because of the tax rate difference and the VLT issue in Missouri. I don't think Senator Hoskins has given up on the idea of also legalizing and regulating video lottery terminals for the benefit of the state lottery and capturing all that tax revenue. His concern is that if you pass sports betting alone, it wouldn't generate as much revenue as the VLT legalization would. And that's why he's proposing a 21% tax rate for sports betting. But he truly, truly wants to see both pass because they're not mutually exclusive. However, the casino industry doesn't want the competition from the gas stations and the truck stops. These VLTs are essentially slot machines, and you're going to go from having 13 casinos in Missouri to having essentially 100 de facto casinos. So unless Senator Hoskins backs off and relents on the VLT issue, it's not going to be smooth sailing. But I think ultimately the sports betting measure will pass. But it's going to be a little bit of a fight in the Missouri Senate. It won't go as easily as it went in the Missouri House of Representatives, where they were tripping over themselves to get this bill out of the House and to the Senate, even lowering the tax rate.
Sorry. I agree. I was muted there for a second.
What happened?
I think I was muted for a second. Sorry.
Okay.
There's definitely less.
I thought that I was going deaf, and this was it for me.
No. Just I have a quick hot button on my microphone where I can mute it. So it's easy for me to secretly mute it. But I agree. I think Kansas has a more smooth transition possibility with the less licenses and the higher tax rate. So before we transition to New York, I think that's everything we've got. Keep an eye out for Kansas and Missouri in the next coming months here. But before we jump to New York, which there's a lot going on in New York and on the concept of New York sports gambling, but also the Buffalo Bills, I just want to remind our listeners here, our viewers, because this is going to be the video aspect of it on YouTube. We have a sponsor, Underdog Fantasy Sports. It's a super easy to use app. I downloaded it. I was looking at some of the best ball. They have some interesting concepts working with fantasy football, where you can kind of draft a team and you don't have to set your lineups. There's no trades. There's no waivers. Whoever has the most points that week is dedicated is determined to be your starter. It's super, super easy. You can create private accounts, right? So there might be a little competition between the conduct detrimental team. We can do a private fantasy for $3, $6, $10, whatever we want to put in for rivalry between us. But I was just going through the app, and it's definitely super easy to use. It's very comprehensive. They have FAQs where you can go through and kind of figure out what their games are, their prop bets. Like I said, the best ball with the fantasy sports. They've got basketball, hockey, MLB, and NFL, all that. But the big thing here is if you sign up now with the code CONDUCT, CONDUCT, then you will get a free match for your first deposit. So if you and it's up to $100. So if you deposit $100, they'll match your deposit $100. So you'll have $200 to work with. Again, that's Underdog Fantasy. And if you use the code CONDUCT when you log in and create your account, they'll match up to $100 of your deposit. So definitely go check out Underdog Fantasy.
You know who they have behind them? I've been in the sort of the fantasy space for about 7 years, going back to maybe 2014, actually 8 years. Jeremy Levine, runs the company, and he's established a couple of daily fantasy sports companies. He's a veteran of the industry, and they've got Mark Cuban as an investor. I think Kevin Durant, Jared Goff. I mean, this is really a rising company in the space, and we're thrilled to have them as a sponsor of Conduct Detrimental and as a sponsor of sports betting industry podcast. They're just really a rising company in the space, and just really fascinating product, diverse list of different types of contests. But importantly, they're not this new company that just arrived. They have serious DFS veterans who've started successful companies and serious investors. I mean, Mark Cuban and Kevin Durant, I think that speaks for itself. So welcome aboard to the Conduct Detrimental family. And it was also my favorite cartoon as a child. Remember? That's probably
Underdog.
Yeah. Did you ever hear of Underdog?
I've definitely heard of Underdog. Yeah, they definitely have done remakes of Underdog as well. There's been a few cartoons of Underdog that I've seen growing up. Yeah, certainly.
But in the sports world, Underdog, has a specific connotation. It's betting and rooting for the underdog. It's a great name for a fantasy company. So anyway, with that out of the way, We can talk about it again a little later, but with that out of the way, let's go to the big kahuna on the list, which is the great state of New York, my home state, where I was born. I grew up in Forest Hills, moved to Flushing, lived in East Meadow in Long Island. Sports betting was never on the drawing board, except for one time when I lived in New York back in the early 80s. New York State Governor Mario Cuomo wanted to have sports betting made available, single game sports betting being made available as a lottery game. And so in the early 1980s, he floated this proposal to have the New York State Lottery run sports betting, and New York would have been the second state in the country to have operated single game sports betting. It would have been Nevada and then New York, and New York would have had a monopoly on the East Coast. And what ended up scuttling that was an adverse attorney general opinion from the state attorney general in the early 1980s. I forgot his name, but he issued a pretty damning opinion, which said that the lottery is supposed to be reserved for games of chance. And he suggested very strongly that any legalization of sports betting through the lottery would run afoul of the New York State Constitution. So it it was forgotten about for many, many years until the Casino Gambling Amendment in 2013, when the electorate approved casino gambling at no more than 7 facilities. And the state legislature at the same time passed implementing legislation, which included sports betting as a form of casino gambling in New York State. So we've come a long way from 1984 to 2013, unfortunately, not on my watch when I lived in New York State. So going from 2013, there was no online sports betting at the time, because when PASPA was overturned, the original sports betting law that was introduced and passed as part of the casino gambling implementing law only allowed for brick and mortar sports betting. So between 2018 and 2021, you really had only retail / brick and mortar sports betting. And finally, the state legislature, with the acquiescence of then New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, agreed on a framework that would bring competitive bidding to New York for online sports betting. And instead of having a tax rate in the low teens, like many other states do for online sports betting, Governor Cuomo would only relent and acquiesce to online sports betting if it could be done where the state shares in the revenue. And that's why we ended up with the current framework, with 9 operators awarded through competitive bidding and a tax rate of 51% that was based upon a bidding process where you put your best foot forward, and the State Gaming Commission chose the companies that were amenable to paying the highest tax rate.
And at 51%, I don't think people realized when it first came out, people were like, wow, 51% is unbelievable. But New York was such a high value, untapped market that these companies coming in, BetMGM, FanDuel, DraftKings, they didn't care, because the money that they were going to get, and it showed, because January was the first month that they came through, and they had tens of millions of dollars of revenue, even after giving 51% to New York State. And New York State saw that. And now where we currently sit, as an update here, right? We have the legalization. We've got the 9 operators, and we have 51% tax rate for each of the operators. We have a sliding scale now. Gary Pretlow has proposed a bill that would amend this to have a sliding scale of the number of operators as it relates to the tax revenue per operator, right? So I'm just going to read off of it. That this is directly from his bill. We have a sliding scale starting as low as 4 to 5 operators, which would be a 64% tax rate. And then you have 6 operators with 62%, 7 drops to 60, 8 goes to 58, 9 being the 51, which is where we're currently at, 9 with 51. And then it goes lower from there. So 10 to 12, it would be 50%. 13 to 14 would be 35%. And then the lowest would be 15 or more licenses. And then that would be a tax rate of 25%, which is where we see more of the precedent with other states, the 25, but 15 licenses.
But it's not just the tax rate, Michael. The tax rate is tied to a specific number of operators. I think the the budget bills that had been proposed by Senator Joseph Addabbo Jr., a former guest or past guest on Conduct Detrimental, by Assemblyman Gary Pretlow, and even by new governor Kathy Hochul, contemplated, or at least would mandate, a minimum of 16 operators by January of 2024. So this is both an increase in the number of online sports betting operators, ultimately from 9 to 16, and a decrease in the tax rate all the way down to 51%. The problem with this decrease is that the Senate and the governor don't see eye to eye with Assemblyman Pretlow, I believe, on that possibility. And there's some disagreement between the three key players as to whether there's going to be any reduction of tax rate. The problem is once you introduce a tax rate and all this money is coming in. And by the way, I disagree that the operators are making all this money, because they're not getting deductions for free bets or promotional bets. So in terms of like a net, when the dust settles, they're making a lot less money than what might otherwise seem apparent based upon tax collections, because they're basically paying, they're not able to write off promotional play or free credits or prizes for creating accounts. So they're paying taxes on that. And in reality, they may not be making much money at all, or as some reports have suggested, they might actually even be losing money. So the recent amendments that have been proposed by, I think, Pretlow and or Addabbo would be to have promotional bet write-offs to allow the sports betting companies to actually pay tax on their real revenue and not on phantom revenues. And the reason we're focusing on New York now, Michael, is that while the state legislative session ends in June, on June 2nd, all this stuff, all these, the expansion of the number of licenses, the reduction of the tax rate, these are kind of spending and revenue measures. They ordinarily go in as part of the official New York State budget, which is due on April 1st. It's now April 3rd, by the way. Last year, when online sports betting was finally approved by the state legislature and signed into law by Governor Andrew Cuomo, sort of at the 11th hour of his governorship, that was done as part of the New York State budgetary process. So in order for these sweeping changes to occur to the New York online sports betting law, they would have to go in as part of the state budget. And April 4th, from what I've read in the New York Times and other sources, is the absolute drop dead date by which the state budget has to be agreed upon by the governor in both houses. And I think, based on what I've been reading, and there's a terrific report from Play New York, which is an online publication, Mike Mazzeo, the writer who's been following the story, he spoke to Assemblyman Pretlow, and he said there's absolutely no chance that the tax rate is going to be dropped as part of the state budget process, because Governor Hochul opposes it. And I think even the Senate Budget Committee opposes it. They're rolling in all this money from state tax collections. Well, they want to give that up now voluntarily. I think Pretlow and Addabbo originally had championed a very low tax rate of like 13, 14% for online sports betting. But now that the state is awash in all these state tax collections, it's a different story entirely to basically give the money back. I think what's likely to happen is that it won't take place. It's been called, by Mike Mazzeo's article, quotes Gary Pretlow as saying that it's a long shot. It's not going to happen as part of the state budget process. So if it doesn't happen in the budget process, that means it's not going to happen in the remainder of the legislative session, which ends on June 2nd. So what's achievable in the state budget? What is achievable is that the focus is going to be on the placing or the citing of downstate casino licenses. In 2013, when the New York voters approved casino gambling at no more than 7 facilities, the statute implementing that constitutional amendment only provided for 4 locations and saved the 3 downstate licenses for 2023, which means that New York City doesn't have any casinos until 2023. So what's going to arise or ensue out of the New York State budget, which is approved on Monday, will likely be an acceleration of the timeline for the siting of casinos in New York City, and which means that we could have an RFP process, and the New York State Gaming Commission will award 3 new casino licenses for downstate New York within the next year. I think that's where the focus is going to be, at least on the issue of gambling expansion within the New York State budget.
Well, just to go off of what we were talking about before, it appears that Pretlow and Addabbo are the underdogs of the legislative process of New York here and what they want to do to expand sports gambling. I think you're right. We're going to see an acceleration of these 3 licenses in New York City. However, it's coming now without opposition. I mean, there are New York City borough presidents. I think it was Coney Island was a possibility of having one of these locations, and the borough president was against it. He says it's gonna cause way too much traffic. The infrastructure is not ready for it. They were not prepared for this acceleration process, because I guess 2023 is what they were looking at. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen. They don't have
Michael. There's only one real open license, as far as I'm concerned. There are two sort of racinos, video lottery terminal facilities, that have the sort of upper hand in getting at least 2 of the casino licenses. You have Resorts World at Aqueduct. They're going to get one of the casino licenses because they're already operating casino style gaming, and they've made a substantial infrastructure investment, and they're the likely candidate to get one of those 3 casino licenses. And then there's also the MGM facility at the old Yonkers Raceway. You've got a perfect downstate location that's on the border of New York City, right, operated by one of the preeminent local casino operators. The likelihood of MGM getting one of those 3 licenses is about as close to 100% as you're getting. So what we're really talking about is one open license that will be this competition between companies like Las Vegas Sands, Bally's, and who knows what other companies. And there's all this speculation that
Barstool Sports,
maybe Barstool, maybe a Penn National, maybe you could have a New York City casino in the borough of Manhattan. I don't see how that could be done because of the lack of available space, right, and all the environmental considerations. But Steve Cohen, who has been known to have a few dollars to sign pitchers, and is known for the Steve Cohen tax, which is much better than being known for the Steve Cohen Memorial Bridge. I believe he's partnering with a casino company to have a bid for a casino facility adjoining sort of the Mets property, and then you have the New York Islanders owners who have this facility in Belmont, the Belmont Park area. So what we're looking at in actuality are probably the outer lying boroughs and Long Island, maybe not even Brooklyn. We're talking about Queens and Long Island as probably being the front runners for having that 3rd downstate casino license. And I would think, given the proximity to Manhattan, I would have to favor the Steve Cohen bid or the New York Islanders bid or anything within the borough of Queens, because I think Long Island, while it's nice to have representation in the location where I was raised, there's just not enough of a population center, and there is not enough visitation to keep those casinos vibrant. I think the best location would be somewhere accessible from Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Westchester, New Jersey, Staten Island. I think you got to place this somewhere in either Queens or Brooklyn, and the facilities in Queens look like the most likely front runners for that 3rd casino license, if we're going to operate under the assumption that MGM is getting one of the licenses and Resorts World at Aqueduct is getting the 2nd license. So all this ties into sports betting, because the focus of the governor and on the state legislative body, the priority is to accelerate casino licenses. Sports betting, modifications, and iGaming, I think, are going to be teed up in the 2023 budget, not so much the 2022 budget. But what could get done during the remainder of this legislative session in New York on the issue of sports betting is to advance Senator Addabbo and Assemblyman Pretlow's bill to bring mobile sports betting kiosks to professional sports venues, off-track betting locations, horse race tracks, auto raceways. And I think there was another category I left off. There's a separate bill, aside from the online sports betting licensing increase, that would extend the online sports betting framework to allow mobile kiosks at these high population, high visibility venues to really build up New York's online sports betting handle. And I think having kiosks in places where teams play games can introduce sports betting much more easily to millions of consumers that go through the turnstiles every day that may not otherwise be inclined to open up an account with any of the traditional online sports betting companies. I think that's a bill that can clear the legislature in the post-budget session that remains until June 2nd.
Absolutely. I think that's a no-brainer. That's kind of easy to exactly the way you just put it. That's easy to implement. Put it with, I know pro teams would be definitely in favor of that. Just having kiosks. I'm just thinking logistically in New York, I can imagine that whole front hallway there, the grand gates of 4 and 6. You can just line them up right along that wall there.
Why is that any different than a mobile phone? I mean, the New York Constitution requires gambling to take place at the casino facility, but under state law, it's been recognized in New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and Michigan that under state contract law theories, the location of where the bet is accepted is where the bet is deemed to be made. Right. So if New Yorkers can bet on their mobile devices in Southampton, Long Island, on their mobile devices, on their cell phones, a mobile kiosk or a kiosk which is connected via computer networks to the servers located upstate works along the same theory. And
exactly,
this is different than the Seminole Tribe of Florida's issue. In the federal court system, they tried to operate online sports betting through the fiction that the location of the servers where the bet takes place. But the federal statute governing gambling on Indian lands makes pretty crystal clear that it actually physically, literally has to take place on Indian lands. And federal courts have rejected the notion that the server location is the sort of sine qua non of where the bet takes place. And that as long as any of the gambling activity takes place outside of Indian land, it violates IGRA. State authorization under state law principles, not governed under a federal tribal framework, has accepted the notion, court rulings, and just the way horse race wagering works in New York. I mean, online gaming, iGaming in New Jersey operates under the same premise that even though the state constitution restricts gambling to Atlantic City, the legislature was able to successfully authorize iGaming by statute without amending the state constitution because the server processing the bet is located in Atlantic City. That's perfectly permissible under state contract law. So the adverse outcome in the Seminole Tribe of Florida compact case that's pending in the Federal Court of Appeals, that's governed by a different set of legal principles.
I think just to circle back to what we're looking forward to here. So tomorrow is the deadline. Tomorrow is the budget, right? That's what we're going to see. Any of these accelerations for these licenses, the mobile kiosks of Pretlow and
there won't be any mobile kiosks tomorrow. That's been the focus. If you're reading any of these articles, a funny headline in the New York Post, it's all about casinos, bail, and the Buffalo Bills.
Right.
Nowhere in any of the headlines or recent articles about where New York is in the budget process, no one's talking about mobile kiosks. And the train has left the station on additional mobile online sports betting licenses and a reduction of the tax rate. That's not going to happen as part of the budget. So the prediction is an easy one because Gary Pretlow has already said that it's a long shot. And with only one true day left in the New York budgetary process, modifications to online sports betting are not in the works, will not happen. We're just going to have to wait and see whether there's some minor modification to the online sports betting law to fold in all these other stakeholders like the teams, OTBs, and the racetracks, whether that can happen prior to the end of the legislative session in June outside of the budgetary process, because that's really the only real chance of any change this year in New York State.
So let's talk Buffalo Bills. So tomorrow is the budgetary ruling of the New York State's budget, and we've heard a lot, like you just said, a lot of the headlines is Buffalo Bills and their tie-in with the public funding, the public amount of money that's going towards their proposed $1.4 billion new stadium build. So what we have proposed was originally, I believe the state said that they would go around the area of 500 million, and then the Buffalo Bills ownership, the Paguglia family, they said that they want upwards of $850 million of public funding. Again, the total amount would be 1.4 billion for their new stadium. So tomorrow is going to be a very key budget bill that incorporates how much money Governor Hochul is going to allow for public funding for the Buffalo Bills. Now, the Paguglias, and I'll kick it to you in a second, Dan, have threatened to leave New York or not go anywhere if they don't have public funding for this stadium build. However, the issue with that too, so we'll talk about their stadium lease, which goes until the end of 2023.
But July 2023. That's
July 2023.
Critical date, because they could seek to relocate as early as the 2023 NFL regular season, but that's a practical matter. That's too close to the expiration of the lease in order to go through a relocation and to justify it and to have local public meetings and to consider local interests. What we're likely looking at, assuming a worst case scenario, would be a relocation for the 2024 NFL season. And by the way, that's not too far away.
Right. But the issue too is the Paguglias also own the Buffalo Sabres. Right. So are they going to leave the Sabres there and then kick the team to a team? I don't know, St. Louis. Where do they go from here?
Well, they're not relocating just yet. But understand that if the peculiar Pagulas, who, by the way, were the first ones to get rid of stadium workers and arena workers at the onset of the pandemic, they're like multi-billionaires who've made all this money from fracking. Right. So they're not exactly, these like wonderful corporate citizens.
It's worth $7 billion.
Yeah, they were the first ones to jettison all these like minimum wage and low wage arena workers who depended on these jobs for some standard of living. And they unhesitatingly jettisoned all these people at the first sign of trouble during the pandemic. They've also sued their insurance companies for COVID-related losses from not having the arena full. So they're not exactly the most wonderful, local citizens that are going to put community interest over self-interest. Now, if you don't think the threat of relocation is real, consider what happened in St. Louis. By relocating from a lower ranked market in terms of a television size, they went from like 22 or 23 to the second largest market. What Stanley Kroenke did was he increased the valuation of his franchise by $3 billion. And he didn't have to fork out a lot of money for a stadium. So he got two huge benefits. A free stadium, or he got a publicly financed stadium. I think he did. I mean, I don't know what the contribution. Oh, wait a second. I might be wrong. I think he did pay for a significant part of the stadium financing in LA, but he got a bump of $3 billion in the value of the Rams franchise. What would happen with the Pagulas and the Bills, if they go to a city like Austin, or if they go anywhere else, it's going to be a larger market. The net worth of the team will rise by at least $1 billion. And some municipality is going to give them a free stadium. So why wouldn't they consider that? The Buffalo Sabres? So they'll sell the team. And that's why if I was a Buffalo Bill fan, I'd be very worried. If I was from Buffalo, I'd be very worried about this process probably potentially getting derailed. I think Governor Hochul is trying to do the right thing here just because she's from Buffalo. I don't think she's trying to be preferential to Buffalo interests. She's trying to save the one and only NFL team that remains in the state of New York. But to be fair here, the level of contribution and public financing in this instance would be the highest ever that's been given to an NFL franchise or any professional sports team. Breaking it down, it'd be $850 million of public money, 600 of which comes from the state budget, 250 million from Erie County. By contrast, the NFL and the Bills contribution jointly, meaning it's not going to be the Bills paying their own share, it's going to be the Bills and the NFL contributing $500 million jointly, which means that the public contribution is almost 2 times the amount of the private contribution and contrast that to Tennessee, where the Titans ownership is willing to put up $700 million for stadium upgrades, in contrast, or maybe even a new stadium, in contrast to only a $500 million contribution from the state of Tennessee. So using that as a benchmark, the Buffalo Bills public financing amount seems a bit disproportionate and a bit excessive and obscene, given how wealthy these owners are. But what are you going to do? I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to just allow a team? You know how the NFL operates. If they want a relocation to occur, if the owner wants to relocate, there's like the batting average is 1,000. When was the last time that an NFL team was denied relocation under the existing relocation guidelines, where admittedly, and where everybody understood the reason for relocating had nothing to do with lack of local support. It had everything to do with chasing the almighty buck. And within the NFL relocation guidelines, it explicitly says that the economic leaving for a better opportunity isn't a sufficient justification for relocating. Yet every team that has moved has, let's face it, every team that's moved has gone on and chased the greener pastures as the primary reason. So if the Pagulas want to take the team out of Buffalo, they're probably not going to face a lot of resistance from the NFL. And then what does the city of Buffalo have as their consolation prize? They're going to get a lawsuit. They're going to sue for damages. I mean, we see how far that got the city of St. Louis. They had everything going in their favor. They won battle after battle in the St. Louis city court system. They withstood motions to dismiss, motions to compel arbitration, motions for summary judgment. And at the end of the day, they didn't get their team back. They got $790 million as a lump sum settlement. So if you're sitting in Kathy Hochul's position, or if you're sitting as a Buffalo resident, would you rather have your team, or would you rather have $800 million? And I think anybody who understands the perpetual appeal and the revenues, direct and indirect, that are created by having an NFL franchise, I think understand full well that this is an investment that the state of New York has to make in order to keep their NFL team. Because if you don't do it, well, then there's only one more legislative session next year to get this done during the budget before the lease expires. And once the lease expires, that will open the door to a potential relocation. And I have to think that it's in the state's best interest to preserve their only NFL franchise. I mean, I have issues not only as to the amount of the money and the contribution by the team ownership, but the location of the new stadium in Orchard Park is a head scratcher to me. I think if you're going to revitalize Western New York and you're going to add value to the city of Buffalo, you should put the stadium in a location downtown in Buffalo that's going to have all these economic momentum drivers to spur development in the surrounding area, bring trade conventions and restaurants and nightlife and all this business activity to the city to really create a major metropolitan center. I think you got to focus on downtown Buffalo. But the studies that have been commissioned by the team and by the state of New York, I think they're focused exclusively on Orchard Park, which I believe is a mistake. So now you're left with the question, do you fund it? Do you include it in the state budget? Because if you don't, and if you don't do it this year, if you don't do it next year, the team's going to leave.
Yeah, I just think the major pushback is one of the first things you said was that this would be the largest publicly funded NFL. And the other thing is the Buffalo Bills of late have been very good, have been a playoff bound team the last few years. If they weren't as good, do you think that this situation is the same, that they're asking for this amount of public funding, right?
No, definitely not. Dude, Josh Allen, they're going to win Super Bowls.
Right, exactly.
Think of all the teams that have relocated that have won Super Bowls, right? The woe-begotten Cleveland Browns under Art Modell, with the fumble and all these failures during the 1980s. They moved to Baltimore, and now they win Super Bowls. The St. Louis Rams, they won a Super Bowl in St. Louis, but now they also won one in Los Angeles. The Buffalo Bills are going to win multiple Super Bowls during Josh Allen's career. And while $850 million, and by the way, New York State's contribution or portion of that is not the full 850, it's 600 million, which is pretty much on par or just incrementally slightly larger than what the state of Tennessee will contribute to the Titans stadium development. So when you think about what happened with the city of St. Louis and the arbitration, there was an arbitration ruling in 2013 where the arbitrators determined that to maintain the Dome as a first-tier stadium, the city of St. Louis or the St. Louis region, the county, the city, the stadium authority, they would have to come up with, I forgot what the number was, but it was somewhere around 700-800 or so million in improvements. They declined to do that and they lost the team. And if the St. Louis policymakers could go back in time to 2013, I think they would have written that check to keep the St. Louis Rams. And I fear that if New York State doesn't come through here this year and next year, a similar thing is going to happen. And what complicates this process is that in other states where maybe the cities provide, sort of the public financing, here, this has to go through the state legislative process. And there are lawmakers in other parts of the state, like New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, Long Island, who don't give a shit about the Buffalo Bills. So the fortunes of the Buffalo Bills stadium financing is really going to be at the whim of lawmakers in other regions of the state who could give two wits about whether the Buffalo Bills stay or go. And it's really going to really be incumbent upon Governor Hochul to really sell this and do a little bit of trading here to ensure that a majority of lawmakers approve the inclusion of $600 million of state money. Or alternatively, she's got to go back to the Bills next year and say, hey, it failed in 2022. In order to have a shot at 2023 before your lease expires, can you bump up the NFL/team contribution above $500 million and maybe bring it maybe to $700 million so that next year I can go back to the state legislature with a more reasonable, balanced private/public proposal.
Yeah, I think just to wrap this all into one, what do you see happening tomorrow? New York's they're already expired. It was supposed to be April 1st. Now we're going to be April 4th with the New York State budget bill here. Do you foresee an agreement coming down
Yes.
where $850 million is going to be publicly funded?
Yes, I do. And here's why. There are other issues that are being paired with the bills. The bills are not the number one issue in the New York State budget. Bail reform, downstate casino acceleration. There are all these other issues that are being shoehorned into the state budget. So if Governor Hochul, makes some, deals and is amenable to making some modifications and inclusions of some other issues that are important to state lawmakers downstate, I don't see any reason why a majority of the Assembly and the Senate wouldn't approve the $600 million earmark for the Buffalo Bills, because the price of getting this wrong, the cost of not doing it, is the loss of an NFL franchise, which would leave New York State without any professional football teams. And a team is worth a lot more than $850 million or $600 million. The value created by having an NFL team, whether it be in Orchard Park or Buffalo, with all the spending and ticket revenue and taxes and all the other related indirect economic activity, it's worth billions to a region. And I think this is an investment that the state of New York needs to make in order to keep the team. I don't have to like the deal, and I hate this deal, but it's a necessary evil to keep the team because the NFL has shown itself to be a sieve when it comes to enforcing the NFL relocation guidelines. And with the exception of the St. Louis court system, lawsuits challenging relocations have not really achieved much success, at least not in California. So you're playing a very dangerous game here of swapping an NFL team to save $800 million and to get a cause of action in court that may or may not win years from now. That's bad business for the state of New York, and I hate the Pagulas for it. And I wish the governor would have negotiated a better deal, but better to fund this than to lose the Bills, because you will lose the Bills without any public contribution, without
Yeah.
a significant public contribution.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to have to happen for the Bills to. I think it's an empty threat. I think for them to this early say that they're going to leave or start exploring options for relocation just because July 2023 is their expiration of their current lease. So
But look at the track record. Look at all these other precedents: the Chargers, the Raiders, the New York Islanders leaving Long Island. These are not empty threats. The conversion rate on pro sports franchise threats of leaving are they're way above the Mendoza line. And I just don't think this is a game of chicken that Buffalo or the Erie County or the region or the state of New York can play here, given what an NFL franchise means economically as well as spiritually to a state and to a city.
And I think if we tie in the sports gambling aspect too, say mobile kiosks end up at the Buffalo Bills.
That's kind of like, I'd rather have a sports betting license. If I were relocating a team, I'd be going to Texas. I'd be going to Arizona, Maryland, Ohio, a team which grants sports teams control over an online sports betting license. And I think Texas is going to be very appealing to any would-be NFL team relocator because there are no casinos, there are no horse race tracks, and you only have to share the state with the other sports teams. And unlike Missouri, which is going to be saturated with online sports betting licenses, a small state that's going to have 39 licenses, no one license or online skin is going to generate, nearly the same kind of revenues that having an online sports betting license in Texas would generate. That's the second largest state in the country after California. It would be a license to print money. So I know Jerry Jones is going to, resist and fight with all of his might any efforts for a team to move to San Antonio or Austin, but he's got other problems right now.
Yeah.
And I look at Austin and San Antonio as potentially attractive opportunities for an NFL team to relocate, because from sports betting licenses, if you have your online and in-stadium sportsbook license, that would be, at least in Texas, a guaranteed revenue stream of probably in excess of $20 million a year over a 20-year period, probably in excess of $500 million of found money, probably a lot higher than that. So the threat is real, Michael. It's very real.
No, I think it's what you said before. It's a necessary evil, and it's not a great deal, but it's something that's going to keep the Bills here for at least, what would it be, the next 30 years. So it's definitely something to maintain New York's sole NFL team. So it's definitely necessary. And we talked. So I think wrapping back into the budget bill, I think a tie-in here, you mentioned it before and I was going to say it, but now it's a perfect segue into what we're about to talk about. You talked about the 2021 New York State budget bill, 2021, where Governor Cuomo includes the legalization of sports gambling. And now we have seen it spark as January 1st, it finally became legal, and we saw massive amounts. New York became the number one sports gambling state in the country
in the first month.
That's crazy,
right? That shows you the potential of the state.
Exactly. And because of that, into the budget bill, because Cuomo included the legalization of sports gambling in the budget bill, it sparked the White versus Cuomo case that went all the way up to the Court of Appeals, which we finally had a resolution just this month or this past month of whether or not daily fantasy sports, the crux of it was whether daily fantasy sports was a game of chance or a game of skill, and whether or not the Court of Appeals had the authority to overturn a legislative ruling, a legislative determination on the legalization of sports gambling. And we see that
legalization of daily fantasy sports.
Correct. Of daily fantasy sports. It was only on the daily fantasy sports, but whether it was a game of skill, in which the Court of Appeals ruled down that daily fantasy sports is now a game, not is now, they've ruled it is a game of skill and not a game of chance, and thus it is not a violation of New York State Constitution, which would have required a constitutional amendment and a vote of the people in order to overturn.
Yeah, here's the real game changer, right? The lower courts, the intermediate appellate court and the trial court applied the New York State Penal Code statutory test of what constitutes gambling in New York. And under this, sort of middle test, which falls in the continuum between any chance and predominance, it was a lower gambling threshold. And the court found that chance played a sort of a material role in determining the outcome of the contest. And then on top of that, the contestants in DFS contests were not the real contestants, the real, performers. The real performers were the real life professional athletes gaining the yards, catching the touchdown passes, throwing the touchdown passes as well. And there was a parallel contest. So the DFS contestants, in the view of the lower courts, were tantamount to people betting on somebody else's performance. And what changed at the New York Court of Appeals was that the Court of Appeals said you cannot apply the legislature's statutory test because that was created by the legislature. We have to follow the standard for determining or defining gambling that existed long before the New York legislature changed the definition. And on a constitutional level, we're going to apply the predominance test. And under that threshold, which is a higher threshold for what constitutes gambling, daily fantasy sports is a game of skill. And what was equally important is that the court did not make its own findings as to whether DFS was a game of skill, but it deferred to the legislature's own findings and said the legislature considered these peer-reviewed studies, these surveys, and all these other data points. And the legislature, exercising its discretion, made its own determination that DFS was a game of skill based upon all these other studies, and we're not going to disturb that finding. So it was really a matter of what test was applied, as well as the deference to the legislative body in determining whether DFS is a game of chance or a game of skill. And the importance of this decision is twofold, because it continues the recent precedent, which recognizes that daily fantasy sports predominantly involves skill rather than luck. And it follows on the heels of the Illinois Supreme Court's ruling in Becker versus Wu. You're going to have to look that up yourself. I don't have the pinpoint site. But those two recent decisions, Illinois Supreme Court in 2020 and New York Court of Appeals in 2022, recognized DFS as predominantly involving skill, and it really, I think, can be influential in many other states where daily fantasy sports could ever potentially come into question legally. It really solidifies the legality of DFS coming from the two most influential state courts in the country. It's something that the industry can hang its hat on going forward, even as to disputes in other states. And then on a second level, what was really significant about this decision is both the White decision and the Wu-Becker, or the Illinois decision and the New York decision, both recognize that daily fantasy sports contests are actual bona fide contests of skill between actual contestants. And they're not wholly dependent solely on parallel events taking place in stadiums and arenas across the country. It's its own unique actual contest. And that's an argument that has never truly succeeded before in the daily fantasy sports industry. And it could provide some powerful precedent for other types of skilled gaming operators to say, if you're going to trade, have competitions based on, picking athletes and trading any kind of skill competition between two people that is somewhat dependent on anything that happens in a sporting arena. Well, those are actual bona fide contests of skill in which we, the players, the contestants, are the actual contestants. And that could open the door to all these innovative skill gaming platforms to avail themselves of the reasoning in these two DFS court decisions, one in Illinois, one in New York, which both explicitly recognize that these are actual contests of skill between the direct contestants, almost like a hole-in-one golf tournament or a baking contest or a spelling bee. This is sort of it's not the lead. The lead was, DFS being legal, but I think the long-term impact could be opening the door to other types of skill gaming that seem like sports betting or seem like gambling that otherwise can avail themselves of the actual bona fide contest of skill exception. And I think that's my takeaway from the White versus Cuomo case.
Yeah, I just have two things to add, really. You mentioned what you were just talking about was the game of skills determination. I thought that what was interesting with the state's argument in favor of the fact that daily fantasy sports was a game of skill was the comparison to daily fantasy sports owners as general managers of professional sports teams. I watched both oral arguments, the oral argument in October of 2021 and the re-argument last month. And that was something that they really, really harped on, was the fact that basically calling daily fantasy sports owners, because of the skills that they need to use to make the proper determination on what player to play and where to play him and when to play him and who to trade for, that they were comparing those skills and that skill set to the likes of general managers of professional sports teams. So I thought that was an interesting comparison. Like you said, that's never been done before, that type of comparison.
It ties in everything that DraftKings and FanDuel have been saying all these years that I didn't necessarily agree with. Right. I for a long time, I said, well, how do you get around the idea that you don't control or influence how these real life players perform? And because of that, it's gambling under the New York statutory definitional test for gambling. But what the Court of Appeals did here was follow or disregarded that test and say, we're going to apply sort of the consensus view or the predominance test, because that's the test that's followed in most jurisdictions in the country. And before the New York legislature changed the standard from predominance to materiality, that's the standard that was followed under New York constitutional law. So my understanding of how to analyze this issue, I think probably wasn't the right analysis, given that you have to evaluate it under a constitutional benchmark instead of a statutory benchmark. But I'm going to say one other takeaway that I have here. It's not just opening the floodgates to all these other types of skill-based games to seek to be introduced in the New York market and using the White versus Cuomo language to support their legality. I think what this does also is insulate online sports betting from potential constitutional attack, because what the court made plain in this decision is that the legislature has a lot of deference for determining, refining, and defining the contours for what constitutes permissible gaming in New York State within the parameters of the state constitution. And the state constitution has carve outs for casino gambling, horse race betting, charitable gaming, but all these exceptions give the legislature the authority, the explicit authority, to prescribe and authorize the rules of the road for that type of constitutionally permissible gaming. So this was a decision about respecting legislative decision-making and legislative discretion. And if were there ever to be a challenge to the online sports betting regime, I think the White versus Cuomo decision is, would pretty much negate any potential lawsuit because of the legislative discretion that's built into the New York State Constitution and is recognized by the Court of Appeals in the White versus Cuomo decision. I think any potential challenge now has pretty close to a low level of success. And if it hasn't happened in the past year, it's probably not going to happen at all. But this decision, at least I think, provides some comfort and security for those few people who stay up at night and worry about these things, like I do.
No, and my second point, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say that what was such a key thing here was the fact that the Court of Appeals gave such high legislative deference under the New York State's Constitution. They even cited saying that the legislature and their policymaking was the cause of the New York State Constitution. They codified the rules of gambling under New York State's Constitution. And that's why they gave them deference to then go back. And they said that they are the only ones that have the legislative process to go through and analyze what they have previously codified under the New York State Constitution, and that they have the deference to then overturn it or redefine it or give more specifics.
Yeah, the truth is, in all, sort of candor, Michael, I watched the legislative hearings back in 2016, and it wasn't like a trial where all these peer-reviewed studies and analyses were subject to cross-examination. They were basically just cited on the House floor and the Senate floor, but that's the forum, and that's the that's the legislative deliberative process of putting everything to a debate and a floor vote. And it may not have satisfied, Fry, Daubert, expert testimony type of stuff. There was no, counter testimony provided by other experts. But the point is that the New York State legislature had at its disposal all of these peer-reviewed studies and made the finding. It may not have been the finding that resulted from years worth of analysis, but it was a specific finding. And these materials were part of the legislative record. And that factual finding with those materials constituting the legislative record are going to be given deference by a judicial body. And that was the takeaway. And so not only does DFS win, but it opens the door to other potential skill games, passing legal muster in New York, and it provides some kind of a sigh of relief for anybody who worries about mobile sports betting. And I think this decision accomplished those three things, and that's not insignificant.
Definitely. I agree. I think that this is a very, and we knew it was going to be such a key mark issue and a key mark ruling coming down from the Court of Appeals. And there was so much, it was a split bench. It was one of the justices in the Court of Appeals recused himself, Justice Garcia. And then after that, there was a split bench 3-3. They needed to get a second department judge, LaSalle, to come up and fill in the slot. And even still, it was a 4-3 decision. It was very close, and they knew it was going to be. So definitely a big impact. So we went a little longer.
This is like, we're going to have to make this a 3-part episode.
I know there was a lot to talk about here. There's a lot of issues that are pressing. We talked about, Georgia and New York with the deadline being tomorrow. Georgia with their session ends, and New York, they have their budget bill that has to pass by tomorrow. And we hit on Kansas and Missouri and the rivalry that we're going to see in the next couple of months with who's going to pass first and who's going to legalize and what it is going to look like. As well as tomorrow with the deadline with the budget, we're going to see what happens with the Buffalo Bills and their public funding. So we covered a lot, but I don't have anything else left. Do you have anything else left to say, Dan?
I'm out of breath. I want to go to the gym. Oh my God, it's a hell of a way to spend a Sunday, but it's one of my favorite topics, 2 hours. And were we on for 2 hours? No, it was about an hour and a half, hour and a half. Yeah. But we covered a lot of ground here, and I think it was important that we did this episode on Sunday because by the time we would normally record Conduct Detrimental, Georgia and the New York issues would already be decided, and I wanted to at least have an opportunity to give people something to think about in advance of those decisions being made. And it looks like it's going to be a split result across those 4 states, but going forward, I think as the legislative sessions advance in a number of other states, let's just keep doing this. I think there's certainly a lot to talk about in the sports gambling and daily fantasy sports space. So as the discussions move forward in other states, we will return with or without guests to break down some of these legislative developments for you. Okay, so thanks for joining us this week on either a special edition of Conduct Detrimental or a new edition of Sports Betting Industry Roundup. We haven't come up with a name yet, but I hope you found our initial show or foray into the world of the deep dive into the world of sports gambling a successful, if long, first effort. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and if you have any questions, just drop. You can drop into our DMs. You can contact Mike. Mike, what's your handle on Twitter?
Yep. So my handle is Mike_son_of_law, and Dan is at Twitter.
That's an easy one to remember. and I'm at Wallach Legal. You can slide into the DMs, or you can email me at wallachlegal@gmail.com. I'm the founding and sole member of Wallach Legal LLC. My professional life in academic life revolves entirely around the regulated sports betting and gaming industry. So if you have any questions or any need to discuss, wagering or sports betting or gaming issues, you can reach out to me at any time. And Mike, for his own part, is with the firm that litigated the daily fantasy sports case in New York, White versus Cuomo. Unfortunately, he represented the plaintiffs / respondents in the New York Court of Appeals case. And Mike, just like the New York Yankees of 1961, you tried valiantly, but you went down in 7. You lost 3-4, and the edge went to Governor Cuomo and to the New York State Legislature. So you came very close, but no cigar. But it was a valiant effort with 2 lower court victories and 3 votes at the New York Court of Appeals. Unfortunately, you needed 4.
Yeah, Neil Murray, the partner who handled the matter, represented the plaintiffs in this. And like you said, the 2 lower rulings were in his favor.
Terrific lawyer, by the way. Terrific lawyer. I
Unbelievable.
mean, his like sort of, he's a healthcare litigator, a healthcare practitioner, but he's carved out a niche of litigating all these constitutional disputes around gambling expansion.
Correct.
This wasn't his first rodeo. No. Around challenging a gambling statute as unconstitutional. He's had a pretty decent track record in the New York courts going back, over a decade, even challenging the video lottery terminals. And just as with daily fantasy sports, he won in the lower courts, the intermediate appellate court, but lost ultimately in the New York Court of Appeals. But the man is just, the go-to in terms of understanding the New York State constitutional prohibitions, restrictions, and entitlements around gambling. There's probably no stronger person in the state for understanding that complicated issue.
Absolutely. He's a wealth of knowledge, and I'm very fortunate to work in the same office as him.
All right. Well. Anyway, Mike, do you have anything left to add before we end our show and move on to the gym or anything else?
No. We'll just do a quick predictor. Who do you have, Kansas or UNC tomorrow?
I have. That's tough. To be honest, I'm just following the NHL. I was rooting for Coach K. to make it. So with Coach K out of the running, I mean, I guess I'm a Knicks fan, so I kind of want Hubert Davis to win. But I think for a first-year coach taking over from Roy Williams, he certainly wasn't chopped liver in year 1. So win or lose, it was a great year for Hubert Davis.
And again, we keep talking about our sponsor, Underdog. UNC is the underdog here, the 8 seed against the 1 seed Kansas. So I've got Kansas. I like Kansas.
Started on North Carolina sports betting. They had a bill that was passed in one house of the legislature last year. Can you imagine if that had been finalized and been approved by the other chamber? You would have had the most insane betting day in North Carolina history to bet on the Duke North Carolina game on last night, Saturday night. That would have been the most heavily wagered upon sporting event in the history of North Carolina. Probably you wouldn't even get a Super Bowl that generates that kind of betting activity. So lost opportunity, especially in Coach K's last year, but it's something that could at least be a conversation starter in North Carolina beginning in the middle of May when the state legislature reconvenes and decides whether or not to legalize online sports betting. So that's going to be a future conversation that we're going to focus on. So for Mike, for myself, for our team at Conduct Detrimental, Dan Lust and Taryn and Stephanie, thank you for joining us on this special Sunday sports betting industry roundup. We hope you enjoy what's remaining of your weekend. And don't forget to tune in to Conduct Detrimental later in the week. We're going to have a good show as always. And thanks for joining us today.